Welcome everyone. We're going to wait a minute before other people join, and then we will start. Maybe not even a minute. Okay, shall I start? Okay, so thank you for joining this session of the virtual seminars in economic theory. And today we have Nageeb Ali from Penn State, and we are very glad to have him here. Nageeb is going to present his paper, Reselling Information. This is joint work with Ayan Chen Zion and Eric Lillathan, and Eric is with us today as well. We are also pleased to have guest panelists, Edward Talamas and Maria Giovanna Baccara. So the format of these seminars is as follows. We will have 60-minute presentation, and during that presentation, the panelists will be able to ask questions and provide their comments. This is also followed by 15-minute Q&A session. We request all attendees to keep your microphones muted during the talk, but if you have a question, you can either ask in the chat, and Eric is going to monitor that and help us address the questions, or unmute yourself and ask live. But there's going to be a Q&A session at the end. Also, this talk is recorded, and we will share the recording later. Next week, we will have Alexander Blodel from Stanford talking about the cost of optimally acquired information with guest panelists Philip Strack and Andrew Kaplan. Okay, Nageeb, take it away. Thanks.
Great. Thanks so much. Thanks so much to the organizers for organizing this, and to all of you for coming. I'm really excited to share this paper that Eyal, Eric, and I wrote together. I should say, you're welcome to put in questions in the chat for Eric, but if there's also a question that you would like to unmute and ask, I'm happy for you to do so like a regular seminar. Hopefully we'll be back in regular seminars sometime soon, but even then, hopefully things like this will continue so that all of us around the globe can still connect. So let me tell you what Eyal, Eric, and I have been thinking about. So, we've been interested in thinking about issues revolving the sale of information. So in a classic paper by Arrow in 1962, he noted two challenges that you would have in markets for information. The first challenge is that it's difficult to convince someone that you have valuable information for them without revealing what that information is. The second challenge that Arrow noted is that once I have sold information to one person, that person can go around and sell information to others. It's that second problem that the three of us are interested in studying. We'll be thinking about what happens when people can resell information. What does this do to the price of information? How much can a monopolist, who's the initial person who has information, how much can he recoup from this? And what are some fundamental problems? So that's what this paper is going to be about, and this is what we're going to study. What I'm going to do is, in terms of the talk, is I'm going to outline the basic problem we're interested in through the lens of an example. Within the lens of that example, too, I'm going to show you a solution that we propose. And then, depending upon how much time we have, we'll go through a general model and a discussion. Now, I'm happy to remain at the example for as long as audiences like, because I think it'll really crystallize many of the central intuitions of our paper. Okay, so here's the example that we have in mind. I want to imagine a seller who has a good to sell. Now, you could think about this good as being some kind of digital product that potentially can be replicated or not be replicated. Digital products are a little bit too advanced for me. I'm from Bangladesh, and so there's like a closet development economist inside me. And so the way in which I often think about that is that this is a farmer who has some knowledge of some technology in an agrarian setting, and he's trying to think about the degree to which he can extract favors from others on the basis of his knowledge. Okay, so I just think about this as an underlying knowledge of state of the world, but you could think of this as being a digital product, and the model is not really going to be different across these two settings. I'm going to first give you a benchmark model of what the world would look like without resale, and this will be to introduce some of how we analyze these things, and then I'll show you what would happen if we allowed for resale possibilities. So here we have the seller who is interacting with two buyers, B1 and B2. And each buyer's value for information is just a payoff of 1. This is a consumption value of information, regardless of whether other people have information or not. And this is received as a stock at the point at which that buyer gets the information. And until then, the buyer has a flow payoff of 0. Okay? How the interactions work in this model is I have 2 links, and each link meets with probability lambda dt in a period of length dt. Each player is going to discount a future with a discount rate of r, and the frequency of interaction per unit of effective time is therefore lambda over r. This is something we're going to think about. So most of the time, these people are there, they're twiddling their thumbs. At exponentially distributed arrival times, a link is going to be recognized. When that link is recognized, the parties to that link have an opportunity to trade. Okay. What we're going to do in this model in terms of analyzing this is we're not going to go through the whole, in my view, rigmarole of defining a non-cooperative game and analyze non-cooperative bargaining. We're going to take a cue from some of the macro search or previous literature of combining sort of dynamics with Nash bargaining. So we're going to imagine that players are going to do some kind of Nash bargaining where they're thinking about sharing the surplus relative to their disagreement. Disagreement or agreement are all represented in terms of continuation values, where they know something that will happen in the future. So that's our notion of, that's our solution concept. It's going to be a simple one. So an equilibrium is a combination of Nash bargaining and what we're going to call rational expectations. And in this simple example, what does an equilibrium price solve? So if I had symmetric Nash bargaining, it must be that the seller's gain from selling today is equal to the buyer's gain from buying today. So let me tell you what each of these terms are. So if I've got an equilibrium price at which this seller meets buyer B1 and sells today, she says, look, I could get a price of P today, or I could wait for the next time I meet this buyer and can sell information. So I either get P today, or I wait until the future. E to the minus RT is how much I'm discounting as I'm waiting for a future time. And E to the minus lambda T times lambda is the density for the first meeting time after this interaction. Similarly, the buyer's gain from buying today is he gets 1 minus P from buying today versus waiting for the next interaction, in which case he's going to get 1 minus P in the future. Okay? Doesn't take rocket science to see that if I want to set these two things to be equal to each other, I get a price of 1/2. So without resale, this is just a benchmark, vanilla benchmark model. Without resale, buyer and sellers are going to split the surplus. So the seller's payoff is going to be half the social surplus, in particular as we approach the frequent offer limit, where the effective frequency of offers per unit time is going to infinity. Yeah, Edward.
First question.
Yeah,
so I really like, thank you for the example that you put about the farmers. So now I have the farmers in mind, and I want to think about the protocol. Have you thought about, because now I think of the protocol as now I bump into this other farmer and then I bump into this other farmer. But what if there's a central square where I bump into both of them? Can I make them an offer simultaneously? So I'm thinking about coalitional bargaining. Have you thought about that? Because
Excellent.
there's Nash bargaining with coalitions as well. So
that's right. That's right. You're going to see that what I'm going to do is we're going to have the simple answer is no, we haven't thought that much about coalitional bargaining, but you're going to see in a moment, once I allow for resale possibilities, that we're going to be able to derive some implications in which, despite the sequentiality of trade, you're going to get a very Bertrand competition-like in coalitional bargaining. Yeah. Here, of course, because buyer B1 and B2 have no connections whatsoever, this is really separate bilateral interactions. But so your question is going to be appropriate in a moment as soon as I introduce resale possibilities. Perfect. Yeah. Other questions? Cool. Okay. So this is a vanilla benchmark. Now let me tell you about the setting in which the three of us are really interested in. is one in which we've got the seller. The seller is the one who begins with information. And now once a buyer obtains information, knows how to use this technology, he can sell it to the other buyer at the next trading opportunity. So he can consume the information himself and simultaneously sell it to the other one. So this is the key issue we're modeling, which is the replicability of information. To find that its information is somewhat interpretational. It's really, we're interested in understanding the pricing of replicable goods. Okay. So how are we going to solve this? So we imagine that the sale of information is publicly observed. So if the seller runs into buyer B1 and sells the information to buyer B1, everyone knows who it is that has information. So there's no incomplete information about who is an informed player at this stage, okay? So we're thinking of this as solving for, if we want to, like a Markov perfect or a recursive Nash bargaining with a state space in which either it's the case that only the seller is informed and can sell to both buyers, or the seller and buyer B1 are informed. They know how to use this technology, buyer B2 does not. Or the seller and buyer B2 know how to use this technology. Or the game has ended. Everyone here knows how to use this technology, okay? So an equilibrium is going to be a specification of value functions and prices such that given the prices, the value functions satisfy rational expectations. What do I mean by that? What I mean is that given the prices, if I told someone to write down what the continuation values are using expected utility, then we all know how to do this. Okay. The second is that prices satisfy symmetric Nash bargaining given the value functions, which means that people trade today if and only if trading today increases their joint surplus. And just for the purposes of this example, we're assuming symmetry, prices are going to split the gains from trade equally. So in terms of solving this game, we're going to proceed with solving it by backward induction, and I'm going to show you two different equilibria of this game. One in which there is immediate agreement, and then I'm going to show you that the seller's optimal equilibrium is actually going to use delay. And also I'll show you what the delay looks like. Cool. So let's proceed by backward induction. Suppose it's the case that the seller S and buyer B1 know how to use this technology. And now there's only buyer B2 left. Buyer B2 can buy this information from either the seller or buyer B1. And so B2 has two trading partners. And so let's think about what we would have in this sort of Nash bargaining interaction. So we've got one customer who is namely B2. And suppose the buyer B2 meets seller S. Okay. And just for simplicity, just humor me, imagine that all the prices are going to be symmetric, that the price that this buyer will buy from the seller is the same as that they would pay to buyer B1. We can prove this. Okay. So what's the seller's gain from selling today? She says, look, I can, if I make the sale today, I get a price of P, or I can wait for the future when I'm getting this price. If I wait for the future, I'm going to be discounting a little bit. This is the probability density with which I meet buyer B2 again, but it must be the case that buyer B2 in this time has met neither me nor my opponent, nor my competitor, B1. By selling information to B1, B1 has become my competitor. And so now I can sell information to buyer B2 if and only if B2 has not met me or my competitor by this time. Okay. Meanwhile, the buyer's gain from trading today is he says, look, I could buy information today, or I could just wait for my next meeting. And at my next meeting, I'm going to buy information from someone. Okay. You can see here that there is a wedge. The seller is worried about losing business to her competitor. The buyer's not worried about this. So now as you approach the frequent offer limit, the equalizing the seller's gain from trading today with the buyer's gain from trading today implies that the prices have to converge to zero. So this is backward induction at the second period. Once the seller has, or the second stage, once the seller has already sold information to one buyer, now I want to see what does this do in the previous stage, in an immediate agreement equilibrium. Questions so far? Cool.
Sorry, we have a question in the chat, so maybe that's going to be helpful. If both buyers form a coalition, this going to shift the power again?
Excellent. So here, what I'm showing you is that the seller is going to do terribly in this equilibrium without buyers forming any coalition. If buyers could form a coalition, seller would do worse, but there's no worse thing to be had for the seller. Yeah, perfect. Excellent. Cool.
I should have asked the question in a more refined way. I'm thinking you've made a bunch of assumptions regarding some kind of bargaining that a pair of people have to obey, or bargaining process. But this seems to me more like a problem of trying to solve the equivalent of Nash bargaining with 3 people at the same time, or I'm not sure if the assumptions that you're making are too restrictive. This is what I'm.
Oh, excellent.
Want to ask.
Okay, maybe we can come back to this discussion at the end once you've seen all the results, and then we can see if it is too restrictive or not for these results. Cool. Okay.
Nageeb, I'd like to ask a question about discounting also. Sometimes we have 2 interpretations. One is that maybe the information becomes less valuable in the future, or I happen to go away somewhere else. So often those 2 interpretations are equivalent between this and our standard. The proceeds are just less valuable in the future. And I wondered here, do you think there's still this equivalence, or would this implication depend upon the interpretation of the discount factor?
That's a great question. On the spot, I don't want to give an answer. I mean, my feeling is that the way in which we think about discounting here is really in terms of it's less valuable in the future. Now, if you think about discounting corresponding to a player sort of leaving the system, this would certainly affect future strategic interactions. I would want to think about it as the first interpretation.
Okay, no problem.
Just to follow up on this, actually, because so an alternative here, besides talking about thinking about the discount factor, is, I mean, I was thinking of what happens if, because in many applications, example I can think of, as this information become more and more known in the market, the marginal value decreases. Think about a piece of technology, think about marketing data or something like that. So I was wondering what happens with decreasing marginal value of information as the number of consumers increases.
Absolutely. So, I think there was like this really interesting work by Admati and Fleiderer, right, in the 90s, where if I wanted to sell information in a financial market, I might want to add noise to my information so that people still have a positive marginal value for the information versus what's already reflected in market prices. I think one of the things we're doing in this paper, this is a great question, we're shutting down these kinds of issues because we're trying to focus on a commitment problem, on a problem we view to be a problem of dynamic commitment. That is what leads to prices being very low and possibly gives another incentive to provide noisy kinds of information or to look at other kinds of schemes that are complementary or perhaps orthogonal to the issue of information, the marginal value of information being declining in the number of people who already have it.
We can talk about this later. I was thinking about how that could interact.
Yeah, no, I think that interaction would be interesting
because the converge. But yeah, we can talk. Yeah.
Okay, excellent. So where we are is we're still talking about an immediate agreement equilibrium. And we've got the seller having sold information already to buyer B1. And the basic point that I'm trying to make is once this has happened, neither of them can gain very much in terms of a resale price to the remaining buyer. You might ask yourself, should you be surprised by this? Should you not be surprised by this? I don't know, it depends on you. For a buyer, the gain from trading, as we said, is simply avoiding the cost from delay, which is disappearing. For a seller, the gain from trading today is non-negligible if the prices remain non-negligible, because she could lose the buyer to the other seller, to her competitor. And equating these two implies prices must vanish. So, on the one hand, if we had gone to, let's say, a setting in which buyer B2, this is a little bit like Edward's setting. If buyer B2 met the seller S and B1 in one central place, Bertrand competition would automatically imply that buyer B2 could get it for free. Here, the buyer is meeting only one at a time, faces some cost from delay. So it's not exactly obvious as to which direction this is going to go. I mean, some of us probably remember the diamond paradox that highlights how small search frictions and bilateral interactions can sometimes push against Bertrand competition. And the simple thing that we're noting here is that in this setting, because we have slight bargaining power to the buyer, I've done symmetric Nash bargaining, this is averting the diamond paradox. And this would be true so long as the buyer has some bargaining power. Okay, cool. All right, so that was what happened in that subgame, if you will, once the seller has already sold information to one party. Now let's just imagine that there are two uninformed buyers. We're at time 0. Seller's the only one who has information. And I want to think about what happens in terms of prices in this immediate agreement equilibrium. To do this, I need to define a term called gamma, and I'm going to call gamma the Yawn Factor, which is, suppose it's the case that Edward and Marie Giovanna are going to yawn at exponentially distributed arrival times. And Dan Barron, who I see in the audience, is going to pay me $1 if it's the case that Edward yawns before Marie Giovanna, okay? And he's going to pay me that $1 at the time at which Edward yawns, okay? So this is what's happening. So what is my expected payoff from this gamble or lottery, if you will? It is equal to gamma, which is I get it at some future time. So some future time, and I'm discounting, assuming that no one has yawned up to that point, and it's the case now Edward yawns, okay? And then I'm going to get the gamma. And of course, as we approach the frequent offer limit, given that they're yawning at the same intensity, this is approaching the number 1/2. So this term shows up all throughout this example. And we've never been able to find a good mathematical or game theoretic name for this term. And hence, yawns, coughs, sneezes, these seem to be the best I've been able to come up with so far. Okay, so this is this term. So we're gonna let's think about payoffs now. So a seller meets a buyer. And the seller says, what's the buyer's payoff? The buyer says, look, either I could buy today when there's only one person who has information at this price P1, and then I'm going to get this value. And then I'm going to get a certain resale value from being able to sell the information to the other buyer. Of course, I have to meet that other buyer first, and hence the yawn factor appears. Or the seller says, the buyer says, sorry, I could wait. If I wait, there's some chance tomorrow that I'm going to be in the same position as today, Groundhog Day. I'll wake up tomorrow with some chance tomorrow in the same position. But there's also some chance tomorrow that the seller is going to meet the other buyer. Once the seller meets the other buyer, then I'm going to have two trading partners from whom I could buy information. And I buy information at the price I pay when there are two people who have information, okay? So now, what are these converging to in the frequent offer limit? Well, in the frequent offer limit, we already said that this term right here is converging to 0 because you never pay that much for information once you have two people you can buy it from. And we see here that if this is converging to if this is converging to 0 again, this whole term right over here is converging to 1 minus half times the price I'd pay from the first party. So now the payoff from waiting is going to be higher if the price I would pay remains bounded away from 0. Here's another way of thinking about it, which is if Marigiana is the buyer, I'm the seller, she says, look, I'll just let Nageeb sell the information to Edward first, at which point in the future I can get information for a price of 0. I don't have to wait very long for that to happen. And so now if I'm trying to sell information for a price that's bounded away from 0 to Marigiana, she says, no, I'd rather just wait. Which means in equilibrium, the prices have to be converging to 0 at the very beginning, even in the frequent offer limit. So to just trace through what we've learned, and possibly what surprised Eyal, Eric, and me, was we have an initial monopolist on information. And this monopolist on information has significant bargaining power, is meeting people bilaterally, but is nevertheless compelled to give away information for free in this equilibrium. And the issue is that neither he nor the first buyer can commit to not selling information to the second buyer. So the second buyer gets information for virtually free. And so now there's very little incentive to be the first buyer of information here. The resale price is low, and waiting to be the second buyer involves minimal delay. Questions about this? Now you might say, look, this is only one equilibrium. What do we know about other equilibria? And so here I'm going to sort of highlight that, in fact, this is a setting in which you might want to have some delay. And delay is going to be, we're going to create some credible delay that is going to result in a higher payoff for the seller. And here's what the credible delay looks like. So I'm the seller, Edward and Marigiana are the two buyers. And I tell Edward, hey, you know, Edward, you're always going to be the first person to whom I sell information. I am never going to sell information to Marigiana before I sell information to you. Once I sell information to you, we're going to be off to the races to try to sell that information to Marigiana. But until that point, you can't get information from her. You'll only be able to get it from me because I'm never going to sell it to her before I sell it to you. Okay. What has to be true in this setting is, so now if Edward and I meet, Edward says, look, I just have to buy information from Nageeb. There's nothing else I can do. He's going to be willing to pay me a half for this information given symmetric Nash bargaining. Also has to be true that when Marigiana and I meet, we decide to not trade rationally rather than trading. And why is this credible? Well, Marigiana expects that she can get information for a price of close to 0. Meanwhile, I expect that if I don't sell information to her, I can get a price close to a half from Edward. I know once I sell information to Marigiana, to make it worthwhile for her, I have to sell it very cheaply, but then I'm never going to be able to recoup that from Edward because, of course, once the two of us have information, he can get it for very cheap. So long as we have offers happening with sufficiently high frequency, it's a case that every time Marigiana and I meet, if I have not sold information to Edward yet, it's going to have delay. Okay. So this is the seller optimal equilibrium. I'm not going through the hieroglyphics that I have on the slide, but this is the intuition, central intuition. Yeah, Edward.
I don't want to dwell on this point, so feel free to just say, look, I'll discuss this later, or we can discuss it some other time. But my question about the coalitions came motivated by this fact, where I think that could you do this, or my question essentially is, could you do exactly the same thing with the grand coalition? Just saying, look, I'm just going to trade with the grand coalition. So here's a piece of paper, you each pay 1/n, the value. And if you all accept, I'll sell information to all at once. But I'm never going to trade with the sub-coalition.
So my guess is you possibly could do this with other forms of commitment where I can somehow make this kind of agreements with the Grand Coalition. I guess one of the things that we're sort of interested in is when we can't make these kinds of agreements, where I'm bumping into, I'm trying to get different favors from different people at different times. That we can't do this, but yeah, I agree. Possibly there could be some, because this is fundamentally, this is a commitment problem, right? That's an individual commitment problem. If somehow I could also even, I mean, this is getting into like an intellectual property kind of issue. If I could agree with you that, look, I'm going to give you this information, but don't ever resell it to marijuana. Life would be better. Or if I could agree and say, hey, Edward, you're going to become the monopolist. I promise once I sell this information to you, I'm never going to resell it. So that was the issue that we faced earlier. And in some ways here, the only way you can get around this is with the first buyer.
So that's the issue. I'm used to thinking about non-cooperative games, and that's where I think they become useful, because to me, if you define a non-cooperative game in this setting, there's going to be a natural extension where you can make offers to, instead of just one individual, 2 individuals or 3 individuals. And the natural extension will make this idea of commitment clearer. It's not just it's not commitment, it's just you are able to make an offer to more than one individual at once. It doesn't sound very profound commitment device.
Well, I guess there's a question about there is a certain commitment to, suppose I make an offer to both of you. I mean, let's come back to this, but I just want to sort of say on this note that suppose I make an offer, I don't know how to interpret an offer to both of you where I say, look, if only both of you are willing to pay, I'm going to give this information, but if one of you pays and the other doesn't, then I'm not. So there is a certain kind of still commitment in the background of what an offer entails. And I think here we're just thinking about bilateral bargaining. Yeah, very good. Okay, cool. So how far can this be extended? So, I've given you an example, a rinky-dinky example with just 3 players. So if you were to just look at equilibria of this sort, you can only obtain the bilateral bargaining price from at most 1 buyer in any equilibrium. So what we show in the paper is that even if I had a single seller and they faced, let's say, 12 buyers, you can't obtain a non-trivial price from any buyer other than the first to whom you sell. Prices will have to be converging to 0 across all equilibria. And so, given that, the only thing you can gain is from that first buyer. And the way you do this is by having a designated buyer. Okay. So this is really highlighting what we view as a commitment problem in resale. And there's a question of how do you solve this commitment problem?
Sorry, can I ask a quick question? I was trying to think about the relationship between this problem and the durable good monopolist problem. That is all, because if we start with we start with a durable good monopolist problem with reselling, right? With the possibility of reselling. So if I buy a durable good and I have the choice of keep on consuming it or resell it. So in this sense, this is different because I can do both, right? I can consume it and I can resell it, and I don't sacrifice my consumption. So this is the first way in which it's different. And there is a second way which is different in the replicability, in the sense that once I sold it, I can keep on selling it, right? The information, once I sold it once, I can keep on being on the market as a seller, right? Because it's replicable. So I was trying to understand exactly where is this replicability part, that is the information part, kicks in, because right now I'm seeing this as a particularly exacerbated durable good monopolist problem, right?
Right.
I mean,
excellent. Yeah, so I think if we try to formulate this and let's say like, I'm thinking of like Bulow's classic paper in durable good monopolies. If we try to formulate it in those terms, this is really, you're right, this is exacerbating. What the replicability means, as soon as I sell it to one person, I go from being the world of a monopolist in that model to a world from a monopolist to a world of Bertrand duopoly, which means that prices are immediately converging to zero. And that's in some ways what we saw in the immediate agreement equilibrium, which is why I can't even capture first on the first sale. Here, what we're seeing is that once you formulate it a little bit less like a market, more like a quote unquote game where I have identities. So it's not an anonymous market, then I'm able to capture something on the first sale, but not very much. That's right, so that's how I think about it. You might say, how should we get around this? So one way of getting around this would be some kind of contractual solutions, where you say anyone who buys information can't resell it. But that's kind of, I mean, even if it's kind of a practical solution, it's kind of boring and there's not much that we can say about it at this stage, given the decades of work on intellectual property and patents and so on and so forth. We've got a non-contractual solution that I want to go into, which is adding a slight amount of history dependence. And we're going to see that the slight amount of history dependence that we're going to create is going to be enough to overturn the issue, to sidestep it. Okay. So one way to view the previous results that I've told you is what happens in Markov perfect equilibria, in which trading decisions condition only on the payoff relevant aspects of history, namely who has information, who has the good, and who doesn't have the good. What we're going to do is we're going to augment this game with tokens to encode a slight degree of history dependence. And I'm going to show you that with these tokens, the seller is going to be able to capture as much revenue as she would, as if she had full intellectual property rights, okay? Now, to understand these tokens, let's begin with an interlude. So not our model, a slightly different model. Imagine you had a rare Led Zeppelin LP. In fact, this is a rare Led Zeppelin LP. It was never publicly released. So you had a copy of a really rare Led Zeppelin LP. And this good is just not replicable, and it's in short supply. There's only one of it that exists, okay? The value of this is a value of 1 to each buyer. And the buyer who possesses it can either consume it or resell it, but they can't do both, okay? And given that the buyers have the same values, there's really no incentive to resell the good, okay? So now, if I'm selling this Led Zeppelin LP, what are my gains from trade versus a buyer's gain from trade? My gain from trade is I can either sell it at a price of P today or wait for my next trading opportunity to do so. The buyer, on the other hand, if the buyer buys it today, he gets the value, but in the future, there's only, remember, this is the Yawn Factor that converges to a half. In the future, it's not clear that he's going to be able to get it, okay? Here, because the Led Zeppelin LP is in short supply, now the buyer worries that if I don't buy it today, Nageeb as the seller may sell it to the other buyer. And so now by being on the short side of the market, the seller captures all of the buyer's gains from trade. Okay. So this is a slight interlude of what would happen if the good were not replicable. We're going to use this interlude to come up with a non-contractual solution. So here's what the solution looks like. The seller says, look, I'm going to sell, so I'm the seller, Edward and Marigiovanna are the buyers. I'm going to sell a single token. And this token is intrinsically worthless, but it's going to affect continuation play in the following sense. If Marigiovanna buys this token from me, then we're going to play the equilibrium in which I never sell information to Marigiovanna before I sell it to Edward. Marigiovanna gets, the token means that Marigiovanna can be the second buyer. If Edward buys this token from me, he gets to be the second buyer, and Marigiovanna will have to be the first buyer of information, okay? And what I'm going to show is that by doing this, I'm going to be able to get a price of about a half from either one of these two players for the token, and a price of 1/2 for information, which means I'm getting exactly what I would if I had full intellectual property rights, okay? So let me convince you of this gradually. So as I said, if the buyer BI buys a token, then the seller always sells information first to the other buyer. The token confers the right to be the second buyer of information. who buys information then at a price of approximately 0. What's the value of this token? The value of this token is the difference in price that you pay for being the second buyer of information versus the first buyer of information, which is approximately a half in the frequent offer limit. The fact that there are fewer tokens than buyers means that this token that I've just created is like my Led Zeppelin LP, which means the seller has to capture the full value of the token, which means the problem is solved. Okay. Now, given that this is a theory audience, maybe this was a bit fast, in which case you're annoyed with me, and you won't believe me unless I show you some more algebra. So I'm going to throw some more hieroglyphics at you and convince you that this is true. So what's the buyer's value from purchasing the token? We can do this recursively. Suppose that value is VT and the price of the token is PT, T for token. So my value is I buy the token. And once I buy the token, then I have, I mixed the metaphor. I'm the seller. Edward, let's say Edward buys a token. So Edward buys a token, he pays the price for the token. And then once he pays the price for the token, he says, look, what do I have to wait for? I have to wait for Nageeb and Mirjavana to meet. Once they meet, there are going to be 2 people from whom I can buy information. And then I pay the price for being the second buyer of information. As we approach the frequent offer limit, we know that this term here is converging to 0. This term here is converging to 1. This term here is converging to 1. And so in the frequent offer limit, Edward doesn't have to wait very long to get the value of information, and he just has to pay for the token now. So that's his value from purchasing the token. Oops. Okay. So in symmetric Nash bargaining, it must be that the seller's gain from selling the token equals the buyer's gain from buying the token. So what's my gain when I meet Edward and I say, okay, what's my gain from selling the token today? Well, I'm never going to trade information before trading tokens. I'm trading tokens first, and then I'm trading information. So either Edward buys the token from me today, or I wait for the next opportunity to sell the token either to him or to Mirjavana. For Edward, he says, look, I buy the token today, in which case I get this value, or I get this value with some chance in the future. If I meet Nageeb again and he hasn't sold this token by this point to Mirjavana, okay? On the other hand, if he has sold the token to Mirjavana, then in the future, this is this term right here, in the future, I'm going to get information, but I have to pay for information for the price, at the price at which the first information buyer pays. And then, of course, we're going to resell information to Mirjavana, who, by buying the token, is the second buyer of information. Now, in the frequent offer limit, for me, what's the cost gain I incur from selling today? I'm just avoiding delay, because I'm just going to do the same thing tomorrow. It's sort of, for me as a seller, it's Groundhog Day. And so in the frequent offer limit, I don't have much gain from selling today. Which means if we're equalizing this, it must mean that Edward also doesn't have much gain from buying the token today. Which means that it must be the case that given that given this above, I'm sort of substituting this term here, given what we have from above, it means that the price of the token must approach the price of information as a first buyer. Yeah, Edward.
I'm confused.
Yeah.
So did you say that the seller now is getting the full value of information?
The seller is getting the full value that he would if you had intellectual property rights, if there was no resale.
But that is, so in this example, the value of information is 2, the seller is getting 1, is that right?
The seller is getting 1, which is exactly what you would have with Nash bargaining, symmetric Nash bargaining.
Good.
Yeah, exactly. Very good. Thank you. Thank you for that. Okay.
If I wanted, hey Nageeb, sorry.
Yeah, no worries.
If I wanted to do this in a Markov way, could I probabilistically sell the good rather than selling tokens?
No, you wouldn't be able to do that. It really is. We're sort of it's in the result that we had earlier was sort of a bound on what you can do in any Markov equilibrium.
Okay.
Yeah. Cool. So what are the tokens doing? They're playing the role of encoding a minimal degree of history dependence. They need not be physical at all. And the key idea is the value of a token is, when Maria Giovanna or Edward says, look, I value a token. Why do they value a token? They value the token because it gives them the opportunity to buy information for a very low price in the future, for a price approximately 0. And so with n buyers, what the seller would do is sell n-1 tokens. The fact that these tokens are scarce, that there's one fewer token than there are buyers, means that the seller is going to be able to capture the buyer's full value for the token. And so what is the seller doing here? The seller is exploiting the competition, the scarce competition for tokens, plus the fact that information can be resold. So the reason Edward or Maria Giovanna are willing to pay approximately a price of a half for a token is because they know that they're going to be able to pay a price of approximately 0 for information. If information could not have been resold like this, they would not be willing to pay so much for a token. So in one way of thinking about this is that what I sort of was doing up to this prepay scheme was I was telling you about a commitment problem. And the tokens is providing a way of exploiting that commitment problem to be able to recoup higher revenues for the seller. Now, when Eyal, Eric, and I first thought about this kind of solution, the way in which we did so was actually by slicing or encrypting information. So we imagined that you took this knowledge and you reveal different bits of it in a way such that, you know, when I sell one bit to Edward, Edward doesn't know what to do with this information. I sell a different bit to Maria Giovanna. She doesn't know what to do with this information. But when they combine it, then they can get the full value of information. You can always do this with information. It's like this secret sharing tricks that computer scientists know better than we do. And once we sort of saw that, we sort of realized we don't need to go through the whole thing about slicing and encrypting information. It just suffices for me to extract favors or money from people before I have sold them information. Okay. Questions about this? Okay.
Sorry, just to stress, this relies on the fact that buyers know that the information is valuable before getting it, right?
That's right, absolutely right. Yes.
So information, or like just to give a bit, like you say, maybe reveal a piece to show them that you actually have something. Yeah.
That's right. That's right. Yeah. So we're not in some ways we've abstracted from the verifiability problem, and focus on the resale problem. That's right. This also comes back to the point you were thinking about earlier about sort of selling information in a financial market or thinking about a marginal value. And that's, we view that as being a sort of a different motive for adding in noise. If you thought about encrypting information as in some ways creating a lot of extreme noise here to help one resell. Yeah. Okay, so what does the general model do? The general model, to put it simply or bluntly, tells you that we weren't doing anything fishy in this example, that things generalize exactly in the way in which we suggested. I can point out where we have to make stronger assumptions and where we don't. So we've got a set of buyers, B1 through Bn. The value of information for each buyer is V. We have a set of sellers, S1 through Sm, all of whom have identical information to sell. You might want to think the model is most interesting when M is equal to 1, meaning there's only a single seller. It's not particularly interesting with multiple sellers. Okay. The set of agents is the union of the two, and each pair of agents have a trading relationship. So this is a complete graph. And all players have discount rate R. Okay. For the model, it actually worked out more easily for us to do this in discrete time rather than doing this in continuous time. So trading opportunities occur at time periods on a discrete time grid, 0, delta, 2 delta, so on and so forth. And in each time period, a link is recognized with uniform probability. And we consider the limiting behavior as this period length is converging to 0. As before, in some ways for the commitment problem without tokens and the model without tokens, we think about the set of feasible states as just being the set of players who have information. So this is what that looks like in terms of notation. And what is our solution concept generally is, as I alluded, it's a composition of a value function and a trading function, where given what people do, the value functions satisfy rational expectations, and given the value functions, the trading functions satisfy Nash bargaining. Okay, so I'm not going to put this up, other than to say two things. One is that there's a typo. The typo is that here I've written it as if they're doing symmetric Nash bargaining, that the change in seller's surplus has to equal the change in buyer's surplus. But in the paper, we don't do symmetric Nash bargaining. We allow for any bargaining weights where the seller's bargaining weight is some number between 1/2 to 1. Okay, so but not having full bargaining power. Okay, so an equilibrium is a triple. It's a value function, and agreement function, and a pricing function that satisfies rational expectations given the pricing and agreement function, and we satisfy Nash bargaining given the value functions. And you might think that this is the kind of result, the proposition here, which is kind of a boring proposition, that an equilibrium exists for every period length. But this is really the fragility in the model, which is showing an equilibrium exists is where we need some of the assumptions we make on the fact that people have identical values and things are symmetric. If you were willing to live with models in which you're not sure if equilibria exist or not, and just understand properties of what equilibria are, if they exist, a lot of other things in the paper would remain true in a more general model. So this is really the source of fragility. Okay, so this is so we prove it given the assumptions we make. So a statement about all equilibria, this gets to Michael's question, and this is what we use, is that once there are two or more sellers of information, across all equilibria, the prices have to converge to 0. And we use this to argue that, I'm not going to go through the proof, we use this to argue that the most you could get without any tokens is from the first buyer, and you get approximately 0 from any other buyer. And I should say once again, I should have updated this with the heterogeneous bargaining weights. The V/2 is just coming from the symmetric bargaining weights. Results with token is to just tell you that whatever we had before generalizes. If the period length is small enough, prepay equilibrium exists, and indeed the price paid for each token and the first sale of the information good all converge to the W is the seller's weight, seller's bargaining power, converge to W times the value of information. Okay. So that's the model. I rushed through it, but as you can see, it's essentially all that we're doing is we're generalizing the example. So I'm telling you that the example indeed does generalize. Okay, let me conclude. I'll tell you a little bit about the related literature, and then I think we can stop for questions. So, we think that this is a model that's potentially relevant for thinking about issues that arise in trading for information, the incentives to acquire expertise, learning how to use a new technology, so on and so forth. And there's a classical narrative we have as economists about why there's underinvestment in information. And that classical narrative is that information is a public good. It's non-rivalrous and non-excludable. And one of the things that we learned from this paper my co-authors and I learned from this paper, is that there are other problems that exist apart from information being a public good. We've created a market for information in which individuals could exclude buyers. They could exclude people from having information. And yet, in equilibrium, despite the fact that people are excludable and we're treating information as a private good, the seller is not able to capture very much for it. That this is a commitment problem that left on its own could result in low seller payoffs. What we've done in this paper is we've seen how to exploit this commitment problem to also solve the resale problem with the prepay schemes, where you extract money in advance of selling information. Okay. Of course, we're sort of building on a somewhat rich literature that started and probably precedes Arrow too, but Arrow sort of identified the issues very nicely. There are a series of papers that highlight both issues of appropriability and verifiability, including a very nice paper by Maria Giovanna and Ronnie Razin. There's also issues of prior work on issues of resale. In particular, there's a very nice paper by Arnold Polanski in JET in 2007 that looked at a very similar model in the undiscounted limit. So where delta defines a limit game. And in that game, he focuses on the immediate agreement equilibrium. And he has a subsequent paper in 2019 in RAND that generalizes this, where you allow for externality effects in information. Mihai also has recent work in this vein that looks at an incomplete graph and finds what sellers' payoffs are and what each player's payoffs are in the immediate agreement equilibrium for an incomplete graph. So relative to these papers, we would say that the way in which we complement this work is, in one sense, we are much simpler. We're looking at a complete graph. We're not dealing with a lot of the network theoretic complexity that comes from looking at an incomplete graph. And instead, we're sort of trying to understand how someone could get around this problem in this simple setting using tokens. Using tokens, of course, uses the seller optimal equilibrium of using delay. So it's a combination of using tokens and delay that the seller has to be able to capture her whole surplus. Okay, that's all I have.
Right. Thank you very much. It was very interesting, and thanks for our panelists as well for jumping in. Okay. The plan now is we're going to move in to Q&A session. I'm going to ask the panelists if they have any other last questions or remarks, and then we'll move to the questions from the audience. I'm looking at the chat, and there was some activity there, so I'm sure we'll have a few questions. Now, at the quarter past the hour, I'm going to again interrupt and close the official part of the seminar. We are going to stop the recording then. But I'm sure if there are any other questions, we can stay a couple of minutes longer and keep chatting. Okay, Maria Giovanna and Edward, is there anything that needs to be mentioned right now? Yes.
Well, I can, no, just one thing that comes to mind or two. So the prediction here is that the market for data is a grim one. And I was wondering in terms of just evidence, right now, I mean, there is an active market for data. So what do we know? I mean, just in terms of, maybe thinking about stylized facts or something from
Yeah, no, that's right. So I think about this as being some of the issues that definitely we had with the market for digital goods. So many of you probably have not heard of Napster because you're too young, but some of us who are old enough know what Napster is. Maybe some of you haven't heard of Napster because you're too old too. Okay, I think there was certainly an issue at some point where you thought about how do we price digital products given the replicability or shareability of digital products. I think in one context, I think of this is why I don't want to speculate too much about data, is we're living in terms of thinking about markets. I think we are living in worlds in which we have relatively good and sometimes too strong intellectual property rights. If anything, we're sometimes worried about this in this context, that maybe we want to have weaker patents and weaker intellectual property rights, and we're worried about patent trolls. I think about this really much more as an understanding of friction in social learning. That when I look at a lot of social learning papers and think about the frictions there, I wonder whether a market could solve the issue. And I think what this is highlighting is that for markets to solve the issue, it's not straightforward. That you might need some intricate schemes to do so. Although I would say, hopefully, the token scheme I feel is not too intricate. It's just using somewhat of these bargaining forces. Yeah. Edward.
Yeah, thanks. Thank you for a very nice talk. So I think I should share a little story with the audience that I think it's relevant, or perhaps not too much. But you told me about these results sort of 2 years ago in Barcelona, and I never believed you until you sent me the paper. So from that point, I'm very, very, very impressed by these results. I think they are very nice, very elegant, and every time I revisit the paper, I'm impressed again and again. So a very nice paper. Just as a question about the tokens and about the networks that you say you don't touch into networks, but I wonder if you've thought about, so once you introduce a network, I'm sure, I mean, you've thought about this, but if once you introduce a network, you care about your position, how many individuals you can sell to, how many individuals these individuals can sell to, and so forth. That's the whole issue. But once you introduce tokens, you might be able to sell token, like you might not be able to access the whole market, but you might be able to sell a lot of tokens and exploit the idea that your friends might be able to sell tokens to their friends. So in a sense, extract the full value of the whole market, even if you only have one connection. I don't know if you thought about this, but I always thought this is sort of once you introduce tokens, these might be revolutionary in that sense.
That would be fantastic. So Eric, feel free to unmute and chime in, but I'll say where I think the main problem emerges for us, and it's really at the boring part, proving an equilibrium exists. So we have spent, without the tokens, it would be, it's sort of both agonizing and embarrassing, but possibly more agonizing to just talk about how long we spent in more general models trying to even prove or see if an equilibrium exists, using a multitude of methods, and never succeeded in proving.
But conditional on existence, the intuition sounds right, no?
The conditional on existence, a lot of this intuition sounds right. I think Eric and I certainly feel that a lot of these results may be more broader than the setting that we have in mind.
Right.
Eric, I don't know if you're saying something, but I can't hear you.
That is where we initially started, but we simplified things because of the equilibrium existence issue. And it's not just equilibrium existence in general. To construct any of the other equilibria we talk about, we must show that the immediate agreement equilibrium always exists for any value of delta, or at least for any small value of delta.
Okay, thanks. So are there any other questions from the audience, please? I know there was some chat action in the chat, and Eric has addressed some of those questions, but is there anything else, or ideas or comments? Please unmute yourself and fire away.
Max, I have a question. Well, I have actually two questions. So Nageeb, so the first question is about the Nash bargaining. So the Nash bargaining is, I mean, the way I interpret your assumption Nash bargaining is a black box. Okay. So, I mean, and it seems that there may be a lot of things hidden there. Like, for instance, I can think of, again, I mean, it's unclear who has the bargaining power, but since the short side of the market is the seller, I can imagine the seller running a mechanism, for instance, a stochastic sale Okay, you sell, I don't know, you fix a menu of possible prices that sell with certain probabilities. And let's see, I mean, how people choose. And maybe I can use that to screen sellers and maybe to increase the surplus I can get. Also, there's something I'm not able to see how I mean it plays, but you know, to some extent, I mean, you convince me with your result that is really amazing that with these tokens, you can basically replicate what I would believe is kind of the symmetric Nash outcome, no? Which is basically the seller gets half of the surplus generated. It's really amazing, okay? But you see, to some extent, Nash bargaining is kind of imposing a limit of how much the seller can obtain. So why not everything that is generated? You see?
Great.
So to me, it's kind of a difficult thing. I mean, to understand what is the role of Nash bargaining in your results.
Excellent. Great questions. So here's how I think about Nash bargaining. Is I'm reasonably confident that if one were to define a non-cooperative bargaining protocol, where when Edward and I meet, we play a very, very fast Rubinstein bargaining game, where we're alternating offers with each other, that you would be able to, that this would indeed correspond to what we're getting out of Nash bargaining in this setting. Now, you could imagine that as a seller, I could do more things than just doing alternating offers. So I take your suggestion or notion that possibly I would want to run some kind of mechanism. If I could design the game in such a way, this may not be the kind of game I want to design. And I take that point. I think one of the things that we're just trying to point out is that even if you thought that the way in which the seller is constrained is that they have to do this bilaterally with people, they don't have access to these other kinds of mechanisms. The point is that introducing a slight amount of history dependence where I can get payments from people in advance of selling information is going to be able to make the seller much better off.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, I kind of see what you say, but I mean, again, I mean, it's difficult to figure out because you see, I mean, you have multiplicity of equilibria, and if on top you add another game with an infinite number of bargaining stages or potential infinite number of bargaining stages, it's difficult to figure out what's going to happen. And the other question I had is related to the multiplicity of equilibria. So whenever we have multiplicity of equilibria, you basically are proposing two types of equilibria. You give a justification of one of them, but perhaps we would like to think of, is there a natural perturbation of the game that allows us to select one or the other? And I'm asking you this because I read a paper several years ago where basically look at a similar situation to yours. It was not information, it was about an invention that can be replicated at an epsilon cost, okay? And basically the main point of the paper was to show that in spite of the innovation being replicable at an epsilon cost, the monopolies could obtain almost all the surplus. I don't remember the details, okay? So it seems that introducing a small cost of replicating, of copying the information, or of selling the information in your cost, okay, could do a big deal in selecting the equilibria that you're more interested in.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. I don't know if, I mean, in some ways, I'm not sure if I would think about that as selecting equilibrium in the setting as much as I would think that really here, given that resale prices are converging to zero, no one really gains that much from replicating and reselling information here. In which case, you know, Edward, if we're in the frequent offer limit, once I sell information to Edward, Edward says, you know what, I'm just going to consume it because if reselling it costs me some amount that's bounded away from zero, there's no point in trying to replicate it to resell it to Maria Giovanna. So you're going to have an order of limits question here, which is the order of limits of the cost of replication versus the frequent offer limit. If the cost of replication is going to zero faster than the interval of time, then I think these results apply. If you've got the opposite order of limits, then I think I wouldn't worry as a seller about replicability and resale. Yeah, excellent. Nice point.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, other questions?
I have a quite technical question. I mean, I understand how in continuous time, the seller does never meet two people at the same time. But how do you deal with that with discrete time?
By fiat, which is in each time period, a link is uniformly recognized.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah, sure.
Nageeb, I didn't get the last point you made about the order of limits. I wouldn't worry as a seller. Can you go slowly there, because?
Great. Okay, so suppose it's the case that the cost of replicating goes to, so I can I'll just write over here. So we had a particular expression for the price that if I've already sold information to you, a price that Maria Giovanna pays for information from buying it from either one of us. And in the frequent offer limit, this goes to 0, okay? The question, which I thought was a really nice question, is what happens if you, once I've sold information to you, you face a cost of replicating this information? The point I'm making is that if this cost remains bounded away from 0, and the price you're getting from selling information is converging to 0, you're not going to have much of an incentive to resell information. Now, it's not necessarily the case. I mean, I think I'd have to work out what the equilibrium of that model would look like, because if Maria Giovanna can only get information from me, then I would be getting a price of a half, in which case at a price of a half, you might be willing to replicate information and do this. So I'd have to think about that. The point I was making was that the place where our results are applicable more easily would be if we're looking at a sequence of games. If we're thinking about this as a perturbation, if we're looking at a sequence of games, where C is also converging to 0, but is converging to 0 at a faster rate than we're at this frequent offer limit, so that the cost is still lower than the price you get from her.
But exactly at that point, I would worry as a seller, because these guys are going to start replicating.
Oh, no, so that's what I'm saying. That's where our results are applicable. Is that you should worry.
I see. Good.
So if it's a case that C is always less, maybe I should have said this more clearly. I'm sorry. If C is always less than P over 2, and I'm looking at a sequence of games where I'm both converging to the frequent offer limit, that's where it generalizes. I think it would be really interesting to think about this variation of the model where the costs are not converging to 0, are bounded away from 0, but are, say, less than a half for this example. That's a great suggestion. I don't know if Eric has anything off the cuff that he can say to solve this thing. I can't.
I do not, but we will think about it.
Excellent.
Are there any other questions? I have maybe the last question before we officially close it. I'm not sure if this is probably related to Maria Giovanna's observation earlier on about this trust in information. It's also a robustness question. So if we had a small probability that this population of sellers is invaded by those cheaters who can promise information and never deliver, and the probability of that is small, think about this as a robustness check of the model. Is there anything interesting to say here, or that wouldn't play a role if the probability of that would be small? I'm thinking about the bigger game, when strange things happen when you have, backward induction. And
Good. I'm thinking about this. So one of the things that's probably going to be true is if, suppose it's the case that Maria Giovanna cannot perfectly observe. This messes with the timing of the game, but let's imagine that, Maria Giovanna cannot perfectly observe whether I've actually sold information to Edward or not. So when Edward tells Maria Giovanna, she knows I'm the seller, I'm a seller. I'm Warner Brothers, I have the digital good. Edward is putting something up on Napster, and is going to want us to charge Marijuana for it. And she doesn't really know what the quality of the bit rate is for the sound file that Edward is putting on Napster. Now, I have a slight advantage here, right? So my feeling is that if this advantage is really only very slight, I'm not going to be able to get that much out of any of these players. If the probability that Edward is a mutant who put on a very low quality thing, then I'm not going to be able to recoup that much. On the other hand, it's
pirated version.
Huh?
A pirated version.
Exactly. You know, growing up in Bangladesh, I can tell you the number of pirated movies that I saw that were like tilted at an angle, and then in the middle of the movie, someone gets up, and then you can only see like, you know, things on the other two edges. Anyway, okay. So if Edward were selling something like that, you know, then probably I could still benefit. Mirjavana probably would want my, you know, 4K version of it rather than the movie tilted at 30 degrees. Yeah.
Okay. I think this is a good moment to thank everyone for the participation. Nageeb for a great talk. Edward and Maria Giovanna for comments, and Eric for you know, busy time at chat and answering the questions. Thank you very much. We invite you to next week, but I don't know if people have time. We are not going to stop the meeting. We are going to stop the recording. This is a cue.